she writes romance, but there is so much gore in it that it's more horror than anything else. But her books sell like crazy because people love it. They love that combination. Her books are raw. And I guess that's something I want to put into my other. So.
I write, I guess mine is more cosmic horror, is probably how it would be defined. You know, I do incorporate some of this kind of idea of this ancient elder evil that is, you know, that somebody is trying to bring into the world or somebody is trying to prevent from coming into the world. That does come up, but a lot of it is just how I first found out that I was writing horror was I was writing tall tales, and a lot of it is done as serial fiction online. And so people were able to comment kind of as it was going. And somebody said, I love that there's this air of dread that just hangs over the whole story all the time. And like that's a hallmark of cosmic horror. It may or may not actually have these elder beings, but there's something lurking in the story that is unnerving. And so Tall Tales tends to be that cosmic horror.
I need to get that. Definitely going to have to read it because it sounds really interesting. And I'm one of those readers that, you know, a lot of people will stick with one specific. I read just about anything. Right. I'm also a proofreader and an editor. And I edit just about it. I edited a Christian lit. I don't, but hey, it needed to be done.
Right.
But yeah, I just have to check out Tall Tales.
Now we talked about this a little bit upstairs, but how did you get into horror? How did you start writing it?
Well, it started out as just me and some friends talking because my child, by choice, their soon-to-be ex-husband was a very violent person, and we were brainstorming ways that we could kill them all. You know, if that was a legal thing, you know, ways. And it snowballed from there. And it ended up being just different people in our lives that we have had that have done horrible things, and it's like, oh my God. So, and we have one that we're calling, and then it's going to be an anthology. It's 100 Ways to Kill an Ex-Lover. You know.
Please do not write that, because she'll buy it and try to kill me.
You're not an ex. You're my husband.
But so because. And it's, for me, like I said, it's a cathartic thing because it's a way to release that anger at people who have done something horrible in the past because you can't do those things in real life, but you can do it on paper. You know, having rodents eat someone alive on paper, you can do. You can't do it for real unless you want to spend the rest of your life behind bars.
So let me ask you,
mine away, it fell apart. Yes.
What kind of horror do you actually like? Who inspired you guys to write?
Well, horror-wise, I am a huge Stephen King fan. I have devoured Stephen King ever since I was little. I mean, so for me, that is where my inspiration on how would I write it, because a lot of his is psychological. Mm-hmm. He has a lot of psychological horror in his books, and that was kind of the inspiration behind the way I do mine.
As I kind of hinted at earlier, I kind of accidentally started writing horror, and so I wasn't already reading horror and like thinking about doing that or whatever. I was writing about ghosts and spirits and the Fae and you know, kind of magic and this interaction of these things. And some of them are based, at least partially, on actual experiences that I've had with the supernatural. And so what I did was I fictionalized them, and some of the stuff was real and some of the stuff wasn't. But as I was writing this stuff out, people started commenting that there was a lot of horror in it. And like I said, when I was talking about an early reviewer was like, there's this air of dread to it. And so I took some of the stuff, and I said, this might be urban fantasy with horror elements. Let me take it to a friend of mine who has like a degree in knowing things about books, and ask her. And she read it, and she goes, no, this is horror. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I had to start finding out what that meant, and what it was that people were finding. And so a lot of my research into horror has been in that way, where I was trying to understand what was in my story that people were connecting with. and what that meant in the world of horror. And so it was, I guess the short answer is, what inspired me was just, apparently I've lived a couple horror stories.
Without realizing it.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in real life or in a past life, you were a pastor?
Yeah, so I, once and future pastor. So I was a pastor. I planted a church, or I was working on planting a church. And then I determined that I needed more training. And so I stepped away from ministry. I'm currently in school. And after I graduate, I'll probably be returning to the field as a Baptist pastor. So.
And are you going to continue writing horror?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's one of the things that I think doesn't get necessarily acknowledged is that one of the core beliefs in Christianity is that there is a spiritual element to the world, and there is a lot of darkness in that spiritual element. And so, even though like my story Tall Tales isn't written from a Christian perspective, one of the point of view characters is actually a witch. But that connecting with acknowledging that there is this darker spiritual side to reality, and that when you engage with it, sometimes it doesn't go well, and sometimes it does. And so kind of, I don't find anything about that contradictory to anything that I preach. You know what I mean? I think that's, I know that there are many people that I'd probably go to church with that would disagree, but,
Having been in clergy world, I certainly know the horror of the church councils.
Yeah.
Those church ladies and grumpy old men, yeah, they're terrible.
Yeah. They certainly can be. Now how, what were you saying? When did you start doing? Because you were talking about this story idea that you were working on with your daughter. Or...
It actually came about a little over a year ago.
Okay.
That was when we first started, and I actually have several short stories written because we're doing a series of anthologies. Mm-hmm. We're just getting other authors in who like to write horror too, because we can't have just 2 or 3 stories in it, because that's not going to make much of a book, because the plan is to have it in paperback as well as ebook.
Right.
One of the ones that I have, because I write shifters. I love to write shifters. And I have
Shapeshifters, you mean?
Huh?
Shapeshifters,
Shapeshifters, yes. One of my short stories has a shapeshifter in it. His wife is pregnant, and he has a stalker, and the stalker attacks her while she's pregnant. Well, he kidnaps the stalker and takes her on a chase, basically. She's the prey. He scratches her and he says, "Run, little piggy, run." And the entire thing is him chasing her and catching her just enough to hurt her and make her run more. He's corralling her until he eventually does completely shift and, decimates her. But he tells her, you should never have touched my mate. You should never have touched my unborn child. Right. And I think when I do these stories, I think of it in the sense of the way women are treated. Women are sexually abused a lot, and their abusers get away with it. The story set during 4th of July is based on that concept. This one, same thing, a woman who has been abused or, is attacked, because these kinds of things happen, and it's a way of taking real life things that can happen, putting it into a story, and giving some validation to victims. So in a way, for me, it's, like I said, it is a cathartic thing, because I was that victim once. There's a reason why I'm not with my ex-husband. I was that victim. So for me, it's a cathartic thing, being able to take these events and make them into a story, make them worse than what actually happened, but make them into a story and get the retribution that way. It might be a little twisted, but but hey, it's in a book,
yeah.
So it's okay.
What elements do you think really kind of define a well-crafted horror story? Like where do you think a good horror comes from?
Honestly, I think a lot of good horror comes from real life, from situations that we read about or that we see on the news. Because you can take any situation because the news is filled with so many horror stories. And you can take that situation and you can change it, make it into something that's going to pull the emotions out of the reader, that's going to make them feel that fear, make them feel that terror, but also make them feel that rage that the person getting, especially if it's a retribution type psychological story, they'll feel that rage and that justification that the person who's getting that retribution feels, or they're feeling the terror that that victim is feeling, and I think it's an easy way for us to process our own emotions, because a lot of times we hide those things, especially our darker or baser emotions. We're taught not to express those things. This is a way to be able to express those in a healthy format without people thinking that there's something wrong with you. Because we all have those darker urges, those darker thoughts sometimes. It's just that most of us don't act on them. And then there's those of us who act on them on paper.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from, I guess I would consider passion. Like, I think that horror is kind of the other side of the coin from like romance. That this is a genre built on passion. That horror is the place where love becomes obsession, where desire becomes, this need to take or destroy the thing that you can't have or whatever. And a lot of it, I think a lot of it comes from that type of approach, where you have the thing, the monster that longs to be human so much that it will destroy anything that reminds it of how human it isn't, or will consume some sort of humanity in the hopes of becoming that. It's that sort of thing that I feel a lot of some of the best horror comes in from applying that passion and seeing where it goes when it turns dark, or where it goes when it pushes too far. And one of the big sources that I've been reading is Lovecraft.
Yes.
I've read a lot of Lovecraft in trying to understand cosmic horror, because, as I said earlier, that's the kind of subgenre of horror that I tend to be writing in. And he basically fathered it for all his faults. But what he was channeling a lot was this very, very deep and powerful fear he had of the world, and he's portraying that in these other forms. Like he was deeply afraid of a lot of things, including basically anyone who wasn't white. But what he actually did with that was he took that fear and he started describing this world that has this terrible stuff hidden behind it. And so that very strong emotion, very strong passion that gets applied or addressed or explored in a different way, it would be how I would view where good horror really tends to come from.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. Because there is a fine line between love and hate.
Yeah.
And passion and obsession, or desire and obsession. There is that fine line.
So we have about
20 minutes left.
do any of you have any questions for us? Yeah.
Where do you see the next thing in horror, right? Because, it comes cyclically, especially the type of horror, the monsters that we have, vampires were big, and werewolves were big, and zombies have been big for like the last decade, especially with The Walking Dead, and then the reimagining of some of the old shows, and Romero's stuff is being rebroadcast, right? So, what do you see the next thing? Do you see on the horizon anything that you say, yeah, I think that's going to be the next one? We're going to see a lot of cosmic horror. We're going to see a lot of possession horror,
I think
because maybe COVID has slowed down a little,
That's everything.
I think just from sheer volume of things that are probably being sent to publishers right now, I think the next thing we'll see is a blip of plague and zombie horror,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that will last. I think what will stick around after that is psychological.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people just spent a lot of time alone with their thoughts. And I think that we're going to see a lot more of people kind of exploring what that means,
Mm-hmm.
and how that plays out and where that can go awry or wrong, would be my expectation.
No, I'm not surprised by that. What do you
Yeah, I'd have to agree because, like you said, we've all been stuck in our own heads, especially if you happen to be a person who, lives alone. Then you really have been in your own head. You haven't had that constant interaction. Even if you've had the chance of talking to people on the phone, it's still not the same as the in-person interactions. And I think you're right. I think the next big rise is going to be psychological. There's going to be a lot of people coming out with books that are going to really get into your head.
Because I just started watching Midnight Mass, which is not, it's partly psychological, although it's more of a traditional monster. I won't give away the giveaway. But one of the things is they're on an island, so there's that sense of isolation that we know. And we, everybody's now on an island, right?
Yeah.
No man is an island, but everybody is, or has
Yeah.
to some extent over the last year and a half, 2 years, right? So, so do you think we'll see that on the screen as well?
I think the screen kind of tends to take longer.
It follows the literature.
Yeah, it follows. Cause I mean, the traditional publishing route takes a couple of years before you start seeing any big changes as well. But even once they announce a TV show, it's okay. Well, now we have to spend a year casting. Now we have to spend a year doing this. Now we have to spend a year filming, and so it'll take. I think it'll take a little bit longer before we really see a lot of that stuff done, at least done well. There'll probably be a small rash of things that are just pushed out that won't stick. But yeah, I think we'll probably see that in television as well, or at least exploring ways to turn that into something a little bit less expected.
What about
Because especially what I've been seeing coming out right now, they're doing a lot of remakes of older movies, and some of them, okay, they do need to be remade because they flopped. But then there are some that they're coming out that they're remaking. One of the ones I saw recently is The Lost Boys. That movie was perfect the way it was. I've seen some of the cast members that they have for it, and unless they're the younger cast, it's not going to go well. Because thus far, anyone that I have seen does not fit any image that you would traditionally have for a vampire. They just don't. It's more like what you would see on 90210 cast. I mean, and I'm like, I don't know why they're, but right now, Hollywood is focused on doing remakes. So it'll probably be at least 3 to 5 years before we start seeing more psychological thrillers and horrors coming out of Hollywood, I think.
And what was you were about to ask?
Wondering if different cultures, for a while there was Japanese, Chinese, The Ring, and stuff like that, and then even with what's his name with Us, This Is Us. No,
oh yeah.
This Is Us.
Oh no, I know
Us,
what
and that I don't know from an African American perspective.
Jordan Peele, I believe.
Yeah. I'm wondering, would that be kind of focused on a specific culture?
Yeah, I think.
And their tales and their myths and their fears.
What do you think? You want to say first?
I think it probably will, because each culture has their own issues, and so I think you have a valid question. I think that we are going to see things that are more cultural related, because the African American community deal with things that those of us in this room don't. So I can see some of I've actually talked with a few fellow authors who are African American, and they've been talking about some of the books that they're bringing out, and some of them do focus more on the fears of what they live with on a daily basis. So they are more psychological because that's what they deal with every single day, every time they step out of their house.
Yeah, I think I think I would like that to be the case, but I don't think it will be right away. You know, the fact is that a lot of the entertainment industry still views a lot of ethnic groups as being a source for like a fluke thing. Like, you know, it's the we're going to make a Black Panther and make a bunch of money off it, but we're not going to introduce like any other black superheroes type of thing. You know what I mean? I think that we've been seeing that for a little while, and I think we're going to see it for a little while yet. And it is a shame because there are a lot of really great stories out there that don't come from European perspectives, that don't come from white American perspectives. And even just exploring, like she was talking about, exploring current experiences through genre. There's a lot of opportunity there. But I really think that it's going to take... I think it's going to take systemic change within the entertainment industry before we'll see that make the rise that it really deserves.
But regarding that, and kind of adjacent to it, it said, you know, some of the best horror coming out is from Korea, right? With, you know, a slew of really good horror movies, right? So, and, you know, don't let subtitles frighten you away from seeing it really good. And I personally prefer subtitles to voiceover, you know. And one of the reasons the dubbing is that you really get what the character, even if you don't understand the language, the way the character gives the line tells you a lot about whether or not they're just saying, oh, how are you, or they're really frightened. You know, you can tell that there's panic in their voice. You know, so I would highly suggest anybody who hasn't seen some of the Train to Busan type stuff, or Parasite, or any of these others, to watch them, because they're good. I mean, they're really, really quality stuff. Bring you good reading glasses. You know? Or you
that trend, because you mentioned the Japanese horror films as a trend for a bit, did tend to take a while. Like The Eye, I think, was a movie that came out, what, 3 or 4 years ago, something like that? I saw the Japanese version of that in 2004, and it wasn't new when I saw it. It was on a VHS. And so, like, it took us over a decade to Americanize it enough that we could release it in America. You know what I mean? And so that's what I was saying. Like, yes, there's a lot of great stuff coming out of Korea right now, and if you go and watch it in Korean, you can check it out right now, and it really deserves that. But as far as making a big impact on American entertainment, I think that's going to have to, I don't think it's going to happen until American studios start getting a hold of that stuff, and that's probably going to be 10 years or so.
Can you talk a little about some of the perspectives culturally? Some cultures have different, like in the Japanese, typically you can have this horrible demon chasing you, right? Or you can be stuck in a place. And you didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
If you're just stuck with it. And by the way, the main character doesn't have a way to get out of it. Like most Western stuff, if you say the right ritual and do the right things, you can overcome it and drive it away and save everybody except, you know, at least the last 2 people get saved. But in some of the Japanese stuff, it's like, no, you bought the farm. Yeah. You know, the protagonist is going to die at the end, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? It's a different perspective sometimes on how the horror comes out, because most of us want the good group to make it through, right?
Right.
And then once in a while they throw one at you where it doesn't happen that way. Like a good example is Invasion of the Body Snatchers at the end.
Right.
Right? It's like tough.
Yeah. Yeah, this story doesn't have a happy ending.
Yeah, no happy ending.
There it is. Yeah, and I really enjoy, you know, seeing those type of stories and examining that type of thing. Actually, because I have 2 books and then I have like a short story that's by itself, and that short story involves a group of Americans just after World War II coming across a Japanese internment camp and dealing with the Japanese spirit that was kind of manifested because of the horrors that they were going through, because of the pain that they were enduring being stuck in this internment camp. And so it kind of follows more the Japanese conventions because it's their monster. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so and I So I really do enjoy that type of thing. I enjoy bringing that stuff in, and I really hope that we start seeing more of that sort of exploration in our media. And it probably will come about at first through things like that, some white guy incorporating it, you know what I mean, and then getting people interested in it, and then they dig deeper.
Now I know I have to get your books. Every time you mention them, it just makes me want it more.
Well, I'm just wondering, like, when it comes to horror, like, for me growing up with all the great horror actors, I don't see there's ever going to be another new generation of a Lugosi, Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing. I'm really wondering if that's an era that's never going to be replicated.
I think you're right, because, and I think part of it is because our view of horror has changed over the years. So they see it as, you know, not as intense, not as in depth as those actors put into their characters.
Yeah, I agree and disagree. I agree that we're not going to see the same thing again. I agree we're not going to get another Lugosi. We're not going to get another Christopher Lee. But what really stands out about them, I think, is that a lot of them were exploring a new medium. You know what I mean? They were, at the time, they were figuring out what you can do with movies and how you can explore that and how you can bring that out. Especially with like Bela Lugosi, he was kind of his early career was very much in that period, where they were just figuring out what you do with movies and how you do that. And so they had a certain flexibility to really embody and then define what that was going to be, and they took that. And what you have right now is a lot of people who, you know, this is what horror media is. This is how you act. You act like Bela Lugosi. You act like Christopher Lee. So I think we will see a new generation that makes that change when we get a new form of media. When we see that happen, we'll get that generation of people who are defining that media in that same way, and they'll do it differently. But yeah, I don't think we'll see that until that happens. And that was our 5-minute warning, so I guess we have time for one more question. If not, we'll just talk ourselves out.
Favorite horror that's out now that you would recommend?
I'll have to think about that one for a moment. Do you have
What was that?
What horror is out there now that you would recommend?
There's some. I spent so much of my time in the indie community that right off the top of my head, I'm drawing a complete blank. Because mine has always been more book related. And like I said, I'm more in the indie community. And actually, there's a wonderfully young, she's an indie author. Her name is Kayla Krantz. It's Kayla, and Krantz is Krantz. She writes strictly horror. I've gotten some bits and pieces of some of her books, and absolutely love them because she was debating, considering just giving up, and I'm like, don't you dare. No, because she's had traditionally published publishing houses turn her books away because they're not to the same. In their opinion, they're not on par with Stephen King, but she's really good at what she writes.
What's her name?
Huh?
What was her name?
Kayla, Kayla, Krantz, Krantz.
So I also, like, most of the suggestions that I would have made have already been mentioned. Like we were talking about how there's a lot of stuff coming out of Korea, how there's, you know, Jordan Peele's doing his thing now. But also, I do spend a lot of time among indie publishers. I'm a self-published author right now, and so I've been dealing with a lot of self-published authors. A guy named Rami Unger.
That name's familiar.
I met him in Ohio. I met him originally on Twitter, but I met him in person. He's based out of Ohio. He's had a few books out right now. The one that stands out to me is called Rose, and he borrows a lot of Kafka type of stuff. It's about this woman who's going through this transformation, and it's this horror story of how that's affecting the people around her and stuff like that. So that one's called Rose. And he's got a couple others that I'm not recalling the titles of off the top of my head. But he's a self-published author who's up and coming and has, I think, 3 or 4 books out right now. So that was, I'd encourage you to check him out.
I've probably seen him in one of the many author groups that I'm in.
Yeah, maybe. So why don't you tell? So it's time for us to close out with it. Why don't you tell everybody where to find your stuff and?
All of my books are online, available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Apple Books, and Google Play. The anthologies will be out beginning in February, the horror anthologies, and they will be published under Wicked Minds Publishing. Spelled with a Y. Wicked with a Y.
And to McLaughlin, I so a lot of my stories start off on first draft form and blog posts on talltalesuf.com. So you can find that. There's a link there to my personal author page with a couple of short stories on it. And you can find my stuff there. You can find it on Amazon. There's a drop-down menu on talltalesuf.com that will have a link directly to the Amazon store where you can find my books. Tall Tales Volumes 1 and 2 are out now. I'm currently working on Volume 3.
Have you looked into Vella on Amazon? Since you do the serial, that may be another avenue for you.
Thank you guys very much.
Because that's what they do. Thank you. But yeah,